got that.
Okay, good. All right, there's some classes that didn't get that. So,
I'm going back to the first slide because I missed two.
which one did you miss? Oh, Tigris and Euphrates.
Okay.
Yeah, Tigris and Euphrates rivers. I'm gonna have to turn off the light here. There's kind of a bit of a glare. That should be all right. Okay. All right. So, yeah. So open up the guided notes. This one's pretty short, so it's not gonna take us a whole time. And then I got a worksheet kind of covered at the end. I'm not gonna send you guys out anything tomorrow. On Monday, I'll send out another video from that Lost Civilization series with some questions there that'll introduce to our next section, which is on Egypt, right? So yesterday, we were introducing the chapter, and we were kind of talking about how we're kind of transcending from kind of prehistory into history, all right, the development of civilization, not just Neolithic sites and stuff like that. And so we had talked about what's considered the first civilization. All right, what do you guys remember what that was? What was considered the first civilization? Starts with an S.
Sumerians.
Sumerians, good. All right. Okay. So the Sumerians is basically considered the world's first civilization because they meet those 6 criteria that we had talked about at the end of the last chapter there. All right. And geographically speaking, all right, the Sumerians are in a region referred to as Mesopotamia. All right. And so Mesopotamia is a specific kind of term for an ancient region that's mainly rock. All right. And the name means land between the rivers, right? And those 2 rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates. All right. And this is what they refer to as a cultural hearth, places where civilizations begin. All right. One of the 5 major cultural hearths. 4 of the 5 have rivers in common. All right. They develop along the river systems. So this is one of the first places, along with the Fertile Crescent, which Mesopotamia is kind of a part of, where we see systematic agriculture. All right. With that, we see the Sumerians have they're urbanized, right? They have large cities. The population's tens, some historians say maybe in the hundreds of thousands. All right, places like Kish, Lagash, Uruk, places like that. And then with that, not everybody had a farm, so they essentially were able to diversify their economy. You had people who were artisans that would make things and sell things. We start to see services start to emerge, like people who are teachers, doctors, stuff like that. All right. However, those you saw a little bit of the diversifying of your economy. You saw people kind of gathered in one kind of place. But the thing that separates the Sumerians, particularly from Chucklehulic, is the development of writing, right? And that separates history from prehistory. What do they call their type of writing? Do you remember? Cuneiform, right? Okay, and that sets the pattern for other cultures that are going to come after the Sumerians in this region. All right, Babylonians, Assyrians, all the way up to the Persians, are all going to write in a cuneiform style. All right, and like I showed you, it's impressive how people can decipher that, and they haven't been able to decipher everything that they've gotten, but enough to give us kind of an insight there. All right, advanced technology, concept of kind of improving things, inventions. What was a major invention that you'd say that the Sumerians had that allows you to push your whip into the parking lot? The wheel, right? Without the, it's revolutionary, right? And so we also see the emergence of bronze being used, ushering us into the Bronze Age, all right? They had concept of complex institutions, government, and religion. Religiously speaking, like most of these kind of cultures that we're going to talk about in these early chapters, they are polytheistic, meaning what? Multiple gods, multiple deities, right? And so religion and politics tend to go hand in hand in a lot of these early civilizations. All right, many of the early city-states would have priest kings. All right, so they would be one and the same. We see a kind of development of kind of social structure as well. All right, we have class systems based on the types of jobs that you do. And the last thing I was talking about was literature. All right, and so Gilgamesh is probably the most famous kind of Sumerian piece of literature. It's considered maybe the world's first epic. All right, and so without Gilgamesh, you don't have something like the Iliad and the Odyssey, but like Star Wars. This lays the kind of the template for these kind of like hero, as what Joseph Campbell referred to as the hero's journey. All right, and you guys did the worksheet on there, gave you a little insight in there. Like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the gods play a role in the story here. Like the video that we watched on Monday, for kind of on in a Western perspective, Gilgamesh is also important because there's a number of stories in the Bible that probably take some kind of artistic liberties with Gilgamesh. Like the story of Noah, because there's a flood survivor and the whole concept of the Garden of Eden in that. And then the reason being is that, and we'll talk later, that the Bible, the Torah as we know it, becomes a compiled text while Jewish Hebrew scribes and those were in this region later when they were basically kind of enslaved by the Chaldeans. All right. So, and this, they just found, I want to say maybe it was a year ago, maybe my concept of time tends to be kind of off recently, but they think they just discovered a couple more tablets that may be related to Gilgamesh. All right. So they may kind of add to the story, all right, to a certain extent. All right. So, that's the thing that and this is all kind of deciphered thanks to kind of the written language, right? Now, moving on to past this. Oh, I keep on doing that. Sorry about that. Don't write this down. It's for my impending Alzheimer's. So, around 2000, and we had talked about how like Sumer and the Sumerians, essentially there was a lot of people there would be a number of kind of cultures that would come in. Some would raid and pillage, right? There wasn't a whole lot of geographical barriers in Mesopotamia. Like when we talk about Egypt, we'll talk about how there's like the desert and these cataracts and stuff like that allowed the Egyptian civilization for a few thousand years to kind of develop without much interference. The Sumerians didn't have that luxury. All right, so you have groups that would come in, like we talked about, like Sargon the Great. All right, they were a people called the Akkadians who basically came in, but they kind of integrated into Sumerian culture. So we see like that the term Sumer and Akkad start to be used more to signify that combination. And then you argue that Sargon creates what's considered the first empire, right? The Gutians, who came after the Akkadians, so didn't have a great history because they didn't try to integrate as much. And everything about them was written by Sumerians who were being subjugated by them, right? Another group called the Amorites, kind of from the north, basically came through and they kind of established a presence in the city of Babylon around 2000. Eventually, by the late 1700 BC, they've taken over all of Mesopotamia. All right, and they are more commonly known by the fact that their base of operations, their foundation city, was the city of Babylon. All right, so they're known as the Babylonians. All right, and so they're credited with the civilization to take over after the Sumerians. All right, now the deal is that like in the video that you guys watched on Monday, they kind of combined the Babylonians from two groups that aren't necessarily related, but they both have Babylon as their capital. All right. Now this is a little bit different. The Babylonians are going to kind of like take over, similar to what Sargon did. All right. However, unlike Sargon allowed for a number of those city-states to keep their kingships. They just had to defer to him. The Babylonians, the sixth king, and was considered the first emperor of the Babylonian Empire, did not allow for that. He basically replaced these kings and their kind of lineage and put in place governors, if you will. All right. So the Babylonians, though, are going to be pretty similar to the Sumerians. All right. Geographically speaking, it's mainly this area that they're controlling right here, this kind of dashed area. All right. So it's all the major Sumerian city-states plus Babylon in there. Not as large as, let's say, what Sumer and Akkad was. All right. And so don't write this down, impending Alzheimer's. All right. The deal is that the Babylonians kind of bit off a lot of aspects of Sumerian culture. They wrote in cuneiform, right? They worship a lot of the same deities, although they changed the names here and there, right? Like Nana, the god of the moon, who was one of the sky gods that the Ziggurat of Ur was dedicated to, became the god Sin, right? Utu, who was the sun god, became the god Samesh, right? They kind of were still urban. Agriculture still played an important role here. All right. However, the thing that separates the Babylonians historically from the Sumerians is the development of a legal system. All right. That's famously known as Hammurabi's Code. All right. This is considered the oldest written code of law. Now, in reality, and this is named after Hammurabi, who was the one who's the sixth Babylonian king, but he's considered the first Babylonian emperor. All right. What Hammurabi was kind of doing was basically compiling other laws that had existed during the time of the Sumerians. And there may be evidence of some legal systems legal written codes that are a little bit older, but this is a more compiled, more kind of basically kind of detailed kind of system of laws. And the deal about is like he's basically kind of conquering areas here, all right? And he needs to kind of maintain control, right? And it's like when you write down laws, this sets parameters. It sets basically what you can and cannot do, right? All in all, there's about 275 laws within Hammurabi's Code, right? And they were, took on everything: property law, criminal law, family law. All right. Now, like the video had talked about this, you could probably sum up Hammurabi's code in the term an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Right? Have you ever heard that term before? Right? And like the kind of video was talking about some of the kind of the 10 Commandments, you could see kind of like there's some similarities in with Hammurabi's code. All right. Like there's a law against adultery in Hammurabi's code. Right? And then, that there's a law there in the 10 Commandments. These laws, though, can be kind of what later we refer to as draconian, right? Pretty heavy-handed, right? Like, for example, if you got caught stealing, right? Your punishment was death, right? Let's say I was a builder, all right, and I built a home, all right, and that home collapsed in on the people that I built it for, and somebody died, all right? If I was found guilty of negligence, I would be taken to that spot where that house was, where the rubble was, and I'd be stoned to death. All right. There's a law like for adultery, for example. If you were caught, I think the law states is if a woman is caught laying with another man, all right, and they are found guilty, they'll be bound, tied up, and thrown into a river. All right. Now, if the husband decides he doesn't want to press charges, then she'll be let go. All right. But if the husband says, yeah, I want to get back at, then that's it. But with that, there's also this kind of the concept of presumption of innocence. All right. Because you would be brought in, they would have kind of a court system, if you will. All right. So while it's definitely pretty heavy handed, there's maybe some punishments that don't necessarily fit the crime. The concept of kind of maybe innocent until proven guilty, you could kind of trace this back to Hammurabi's code. All right. Now, there's a number of these basalt kind of codes here. All right. And so, like I said, all along here is like 275 laws. All right. Now, not everybody could read or write in the ancient world, like I said. What's also important is what they call the fingernail image at the top, which is significant. It's a visual which shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god Semesh. All right. So what this is basically stating that these laws are not just necessarily made by one man, but they are divinely inspired, right? So you are not just basically breaking the laws of Hammurabi and the Babylonian government, but you're breaking the laws of the gods, all right? So that is for people who can't read these laws, that is particularly important, all right? Now, another thing about this is that like in our legal system, we like to say justice is blind, right? And there's that symbol of Lady Justice holding the scales with a blindfold on. What that means is basically, right, is that everybody's supposed to be equal under the law, right? And so while that's not always true, okay, a lot of times money talks, right? If you're particularly wealthy, you tend to get better lawyers and they can find a way around the system, all right? But we have that ideal that everybody's equal under the law. The Babylonians didn't even pretend, all right? So what the Babylonians would do is they would essentially basically determine your punishment on your position in society, your class. All right. And so that was what was listed in in Hammurabi's code, and is the kind of these obviously you have the highest class, you have the royalty, all right. But when it pertains to kind of law here, right, the kind of an Awalu is a free person of an upper class, like a wealthy merchant, doctor, somebody who's a government official. Meshkenu are a free person of a low estate, usually the farmers, right, the artisans, okay? And then the lowest of the low, like in Asai, what the Babylonians would refer to as wardu, which are basically slaves, all right? So there's one law that states like if a doctor is performing surgery on, let's say, an Awalu, right, and that guy dies, that doctor can have his hand cut off, which seems like that's the end of your career, right? Now, let's say that doctor was performing surgery on a slave that's listed in the same law. The doctor would basically have to pay the slave owner monetary compensation, all right? Same kind of thing when we talk about an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing. It's like in the law, it's basically if a man knocks out another man's eye or breaks another man's bone, then he in turn will kind of receive that punishment in kind. However, when it was determined, it was a lot of times like when the justice would be carried out, it would be based a little bit on class. All right. So let's say Isabella and I were basically kind of we're beefing. We get into a fight, and I knock out Isabella's eye. All right. Now let's say I am a Meshkenu, and Isabella is an Awalu. All right. My punishment would be I'm losing an eye. Okay. if the tables were reversed, if she was in Oahu, she knocked out my island as a Mishkenu, all right, her punishment would probably be monetary compensation. Now, let's say I was a slave and she was in Oahu and she killed me, all right, or like did, like physically harm me and whatever. She's paying monetary compensation. Okay, so there's a definite distinction in punishment based on class. Yeah.
So would they just give it to her family or something?
Yeah, that would go to the family. All right, and so like I said, the laws are pretty like detailed. They deal with everything from property rights to basically kind of like like family law and stuff like that. A woman was allowed to divorce, but she had to go through it. Basically, had to be proven that she wasn't to be blamed for the divorce. All right. Usually, it was if the husband just got tired of her. All right, and it was determined that he did not want her anymore, that she could actually take her dowry back. All right. But it's still pretty kind of heavy-handed on kind of male-dominated society. But definitely classes, there's a distinction in class. Now, that being said, in the House of Representatives, there's it's like a little museum. They have these bas reliefs, these cameos, these images of like major law givers in the world, and Hammurabi's in there. Although a lot of like Hammurabi's laws we wouldn't want to try to emulate to a certain extent. But he's important in the idea of basically compiling these. Now, again, he did not do this. He is credited with this. He has somebody else, other people that kind of compile these laws. But the laws might bear his name. All right. And that's mainly in the idea here was he's trying to kind of control an area that he did not initially control. So you set parameters here. All right. And this is going to set precedents for other legal systems in the area. All right. And like I said, you see this, the video talked about, there's some influence on kind of biblical law. Based on the fact that scribes, probably who wrote the Torah, were in Mesopotamia during that kind of time of captivity. Okay. All right. So what I got here, last thing, done with notes. There's a worksheet I have on Hammurabi's Code that has some of the laws in there. You can open that up and then, kind of answer the questions on a separate Google Doc and then send it back. Those of you guys who are at home, I'm done recording. Later.